Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second of 3 lectures collectively titled Krasner in Context by the foremost experts on Krasner's life and work in conjunction with the current exhibition at the Pollock Krasner House and Study Center. I'm Helen Harrison, the museum's director, and I want to thank Victoria Pilato, the Stony Brook University digital librarian, for co-hosting this series, and Stony Brook's John H. Marburger III Fund and the Herman Goldman Foundation for supporting it. Today's speaker is Ellen G. Landau, the Andrew W. Mellon Professor Emerita at Case Western Reserve University, and the compiler of the Lee Krasner catalogue raisonné, which was published by Abrams in 1995. Now an independent art historian and curator, she writes widely on abstract expressionism, and she will consider how Krasner's reputation among the abstract expressionists has evolved over the decades. A former scholar in residence at the Pollock Krasner House and a frequent speaker in our lecture series, Ellen is the author of numerous essays, exhibition catalogs, and books, including an acclaimed monograph on Jackson Pollock, also published by Abrams. Her most recent book, co-authored with Joan Martyr, who is here with us, is Abstract Expressionists, the Women, an in-depth study of the artists represented in the Levitt collection, which was published by Merrill in April of this year. So I'm going to ask everyone to stay muted during Ellen's talk, put your comments or questions in the chat, and we will have a Q&A to follow. So I'm going to turn it over to Ellen.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to Helen for inviting me, and how honored I am to be giving a talk in this sort of last wonderful exhibition that she's done in the 30-some years or whatever that she's been at the Pollock Krasner House and Study Center. So I'm real pleased to be doing this. All right, so the title of my talk is Krasner Now, and you'll see where that's going, because in order to talk about Krasner now, I have to talk about Krasner then. So that's how we're sort of going to start out. All right, when London's Barbican Centre announced in 2018 it would soon feature only the second ever solo retrospective of the work of Lee Krasner in Europe, her first anywhere had also been in London at the Whitechapel Gallery in 1965, many press announcements of the upcoming exhibition ran along all too predictable lines. These were not dissimilar to initial reactions to its predecessor more than half a century prior ago. Various versions of, quote, Jackson Pollock's artist wife to get major Barbican exhibition introduced this event yet again as an opportunity to display work by the spouse of a famous painter, albeit one already more than somewhat recognizable as, quote, an artist in her own right. Of course, this much overused cliche, which is so frequently marshaled in regard to women, and especially those partnered with or daughters of noted male sculptors and painters, sets up from the very start a not very subtle diminishment, coloring viewers' anticipations before they even ever see any art. Lee Krasner, as has often been remarked by herself and others, had to work extra hard to finally come out from under Pollock's shadow. As she conceded to a newspaper reporter in 1973, I was not the average woman married to the average painter. I was married to Jackson Pollock. The context is bigger, and even if I was not personally dominated by Pollock, the whole art world was. Other of her statements made at assorted different times did, however, soften or contradict this denial. Not even a decade into Krasner and Pollock's personal and artistic relationship, their joint participation in Artists, Man and Wife, a regrettably titled 1949 exhibition at the Sydney Janus Gallery, set up by implication an expectation across the board about which member of the 9 partners presented was to be considered significant and which dismissible as the other. Reviewing this show, for example, Gretchen Munson of Art News specifically singled out Krasner for, quote, tidying up her husband's style. Lee Krasner, Mrs. Jackson Pollock, takes her husband's paints and enamels and changes his unrestrained sweeping line into neat little squares and triangles, she wrote. In Stuart Preston's New York Times review, Krasner and Pollock were also cited, as were Willem and Elaine de Kooning, for principally exemplifying his general perception of the show. On the whole, Preston wrote, husbands are the most adventurous, giving ideas their heads, where the wives are apt to hold ideas back by the short reins of the particular scheme of design or color on which they are based. This, he continues, is noticeably true of the Jackson Pollock on view, and I think that this is the one, as opposed to Lee Krasner's conglomeration of little forms, both, quote, fastened and divided by a linear white honeycomb. The actual work she exhibited, Junk Dump Fair, is now lost, but it was probably similar to these other little images that you see on the screen. An article published 10 years later in Arts Magazine expanded the cast of characters she seemed to others to overly rely upon. Its writer situates Krasner's paintings in a relationship to Jackson Pollock's as corresponding to that of Juan Grie's Cubist works to Picasso or Brock's, or of Dufy's Fauve paintings to Matisse. In other words, a lesser imitation or stylistic offshoot. It's of interest at this point, by the way, to mention that between 1951 and 1954, during Pollock's lifetime, Lee Krasner's work on its own generated merely 4 very brief reviews. Well over 200 articles were devoted to Pollock during that same time period. One of the few English language critiques of a later exhibition singularly devoted to examining together Krasner and Pollock, both of whom were now deceased, was held in 1989 at the Kunstmuseum Bern in Switzerland as part of a series on married artistic partnerships. An extended commentary on this joint retrospective, for which I was co-curator, appeared in Art International in 1990. Titling his article, In the Shadow of an Innovator, a version of so many other article titles before and since, American art historian Stephen Polcari made as well an all too familiar appraisal. One is struck, he concluded, by the contrast between a powerful and haunted artist of real originality and a talented painter who worked on the margins of that originality, slowly and only fitfully making her own distinct contribution. Hans Namuth's famous 1950 photograph of the 2 married artists in Pollock's barn studio that you can see here was used for the Swiss exhibition poster, appears to provide visual confirmation backing up the truth of this trope. In it, wearing a house dress and bedroom slippers, Lee sits on a tall stool passively in the background watching Jackson, who looms in the foreground, actively flinging paint. That same year, Burton Richet's Talk of the Town column in the New Yorker called Unframed Space ratcheted up her comparative domestication. Here, the couple's roles are reversed, but in the kitchen, not where art is made. Jackson is mentioned as lounging there, drinking coffee and smoking, looking on with pride, while she, described as a slim, auburn-haired young woman, quote, also an artist, is bent over a hot stove making currant jelly. Interestingly, however, throughout the interview, and Richet, like Namuth, was a friend of theirs, Pollock praises Krasner's artistic work ethic and mostly defers to her for explanations of his own paintings. It is she who provides the column's subsequently much quoted title, i.e. Unframed Space. Prior to the Whitechapel's 1965 London showing, about which much more later, Krasner's only simulation of a retrospective in the United States had been a small 15-page exhibit of works done from 1947 to 1959, held the latter year at East Hampton's artist-run Signa Gallery. A number of her works now considered important, such as Stop and Go, exhibited there as Yes and No, Prophecy, and Blue Level were first shown there. Over 3 decades later, a comprehensive traveling retrospective organized by critic and curator Barbara Rose opened at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, subsequently making 4 additional American stops. This show culminated in 1985 with a presentation divided between the Museum of Modern Art for paintings and collage and the Brooklyn Museum, where drawings and other works of paper were shown. Sadly, by the time it reached the place where Krasner had lived and painted most of her life, she had already succumbed to a variety of medical problems and was never able to enjoy a much desired presentation of her artistry directly in the context of the New York School. Later, during 1999 to 2001, another assessment of her lifetime achievement, accompanied by a handsome art historical monograph, was organized by Robert Hobbs under the auspices of Independent Curators International. That's the book on the right. It likewise traveled around the United States. Hobbs' catalog essay focused more specifically on Krasner's connection to the New York Jewish intellectual scene and its impact or not detectable in her career. Each of these two shows, that's the Houston catalog on the left, claiming vindication for Lee Krasner as an artist above and beyond her by then famously naughty status as the example art widow, received a moderate degree of professional and popular press attention. I wrote a positive review of her Houston debut in the February 1984 issue of Art News, for which Krasner sent her appreciation. In my article, I explained how Marcia Tucker's Whitney Museum of American Art exhibit 10 years prior, which had focused on a selection of Krasner's large paintings from 1951 to 1973, as well as that same museum's Abstract Expressionism in the formative years, an earlier group show organized by Hobbs and Gail Levin in 1978, had more boldly presented her than in the past as one of the major practitioners and even a first-generation pioneer of this influential movement, previously considered all male. Created at the same time as Pollock's much larger and well-known dripped and poured paintings, Krasner's foundational all-over little images, and here you see them at the MoMA show, painted in 1947 to 50, including such as, rather, the one critiqued in 1949, Junk Dump Fair, were a particular surprise for the many more visitors who came to the latter. Reviewing an exhibition in February 1979, conservative critic Hilton Kramer of the New York Times focused on recent canvases of the category Tucker had shown. One of this type, portrait in green, is the subject of Mark Panicki's action photographs of her at work, grouped together in the Pollock Krasner House and Study Center's current summer show. Kramer attributed Krasner's new visibility and status upgrade during the 70s to the two above-mentioned Whitney exhibitions, combined with the influence of the women's movement, where the indomitable Lee Krasner reigned supreme as a feminist icon. This was a favorite illustration or favorite photograph for the many feminist publications, as well as Krasner's current representation by the influential Pace Gallery, where additional big works from 1959 to 62 in Pollock's studio were being presented. These, Kramer wrote, represent abstract expressionist painting of the classic type. Guardian was in that exhibition. All energy and struggle and outsized gesture finally resolved in a pattern of heart-won coherence. Situating his nominal subject, Krasner, as a disciple or at least a kindred spirit energized by Pollock's originality. Another show by Barbara Rose, this one a small but well-publicized presentation entitled Krasner Pollock, A Working Relationship, had been on view at Guildhall in East Hampton and the Gray Art Gallery at NYU before her Houston retrospective opened. This boutique show zeroed in on a point Rose would later elaborate in her more extensive catalog for the much larger touring presentation. Lee and Jackson, Rose maintained, had worked at the same time with the same ideas, arriving at the same place simultaneously, both borrowing from and sharing with each other. I took a slightly different point of view toward the similarities between Krasner and Pollock, beginning in my Houston review, which you can see on the right, and then elaborated elsewhere, by choosing not to simply just pick out the similarities between them, but to try and identify what characteristics differentiated the two artists from each other, even at points where they appeared the most alike. I expanded to a larger group of paintings throughout her career, what art historian Ann Wagner wrote about the little images, that Krasner should not be demeaned for these, but rather be lauded for the strategic and intentional way they view and review Pollock. I sought to investigate, as Wagner so well put it, the fact that Krasner had to figure out a way to distinguish herself from Pollock without her work being perceived as merely a feminist version of his. To cite one example, as Hobbs has pointed out, the calligraphic manner evident in her paintings gave her a measure of control that the other abstract expressionists didn't have. There was also her exceptional brilliance at collage, a direction Pollock never chose to take. Of course, I've always wondered whether Bald Eagle on the left was a reference to him. In my introduction to Krasner's 1995 catalog raisonné, for which I was editor, I delved a bit further into their obviously special dialogue, for which elsewhere I borrowed an exceedingly apt designation, citing their mutuality as a particularly riveting example of David Shapiro's concept, the erotics of influence. My arguments in the raisonné intro, titled Forming Krasner's Identity, were primarily intended to counteract continual misunderstanding about their connection, one that, compared to his, repeatedly devalued her work, in the harsh words of noted philosopher critic Arthur Danto, and this is the worst one, as, quote, effort detached from inspiration. While the MoMA presentation of Rose's Houston show did inspire some critical admiration, Kay Lawrence, for example, wrote in the New Yorker that Krasner's retrospective has the eerie overtones of a tale told by Rip Van Winkle. Suddenly, out of the official silence of 40 years, an artist of major stature has been added to the New York school. By contrast, Danto complained in The Nation about what he saw there. There was no recurrent touch or whatever may be the pictorial equivalent of voice anywhere evident, he said, in Krasner's works on offer. Going back centuries before the previously quoted followers of Matisse, Braque, and Picasso, by comparing her with Domenichino in relation to Poussin and Raphael, Danto could opine further that there was nothing original to be found in Krasner's oeuvre, quote, only the shadows of other selves, the echoes of other voices. His final conclusion was even more ungenerous. Lee Krasner is what she is, Danto wrote, or perhaps more accurately, she is what she isn't. In retrospect, we can now see clearly that written in 1985, his was already a backward assessment. Far from being simply derivative, her purposeful colloquy with modernist artists she admired can be seen, in the words of T.J. Clark, as an example of call and response, a prominent tactic of postmodern appropriation. Krasner's acceptance of the challenge of innovations by others helped her to formulate a more flexible vocabulary, one she could utilize to reinvigorate, not just copy for purposes of her own. Much has definitely changed in the almost 25 years that have now passed since Danto's patronizing proclamations. The worst of a great many other examples. There we go. The worst of a great many other examples by predominantly male critics who stubbornly objected to enlarging the accepted canon of male artists responsible for the so-called triumph of American painting. Indeed, her long overdue next retrospective, British curator Eleanor Nairn's major 2019 exhibition at the Barbican, quickly became an internationally recognized success, unquestionably vindicating Krasner's importance and uniqueness, almost 3 decades after Kay Larson's postulation that she had already deserved such like designation. What additional factors have been most responsible for Lee Krasner's 21st century reevaluation? One trigger has certainly been the explosive popularity of Mary Gabriel's 2018 multiple biography, 9th Street Women, with the rather long subtitle, Lee Krasner, Elaine de Kooning, Grace Hardigan, Joan Mitchell, and Helen Frankenthaler, 5 painters and the movement that changed modern art. This hefty 865-page volume likewise unexpectedly became a blockbuster phenomenon. Published in the wake of the #MeToo movement and at a time when record numbers of female Americans were running for Congress and other elected offices around the USA, 9th Street Women garnered a great deal of publicity for the author and numerous rave reviews, particularly in mainstream media sources. The Canvas Ceiling, a multi-page feature article in the New Yorker, characterized it as an indispensable study of New York's post-war female painters and the obstacles they faced. Gabriel's focus on accomplished but overlooked historical women in her 3 prior books, one of which earned a nomination for a Pulitzer Prize, helped to generate widespread attention for the goals of this one. A former Reuters editor, Gabriel had wanted for a very long time to resurrect the reputations and key roles played by first and second generation abstract expressionist women in New York's supposedly macho mid-century takeover of the mantle of artistic innovation from Paris. While she apparently worked on 9th Street Women for at least 7 years, and Gabriel's first conversation with Grace Hardigan, its inspiration, took place in 1990, by the time it came out, all 5 of the painters she chose to concentrate on had already been given recent starring roles, amongst a total of 12, in the well-received 2016 Denver Art Museum traveling show, Women of Abstract Expressionism. They and others received new and original art historical and biographical attention in a substantial accompanying catalog, which has by now sold copies in the thousands. The Denver exhibit was soon followed by 2 related offshoots, Sparkling Amazons, Abstract Expressionist Women of the 9th Street Show, and Heroines of Abstract Expressionism, both held in smaller museums near the East Coast in 2019. That more than 60 years ago, the 5 women in Gabriel's subtitle had, along with numerous male and female peers, exhibited in a landmark 1951 downtown Manhattan exhibition, allowed her a hook on which to hang her assertion that especially the particular women named on the cover, or the inside cover, you didn't see them on the outside cover, where Krasner, the eldest of the group, is listed first, still needed better recognition as constituting or helping foster a movement to revise modern art in multiple ways, differing from the men who were their colleagues. Her selected main protagonists, Gabriel declares, form part of a new breed of women artists existing unapologetically outside the mainstream of American life at mid-century. She provides multiple contexts that take into account art world, global, and gender politics, although she ends her primary discussion a bit early in 1959, only 3 years after the death of Jackson Pollock, who hovers in the background of the book, not just for his wife, but for most of those women. Lee Krasner would live and continue to paint for almost another 3 decades behind her husband's fatal auto accident. None of the others in Gabriel's group had an initial retrospective taking place out of the United States, although Joan Mitchell's career did advance more predominantly after she moved to France. Almost 2 decades before Rose's Houston show, Krasner's 1965 Whitechapel exhibition did not travel, but it did follow a series of distinguished one-man presentations in that same venue of key US male abstractionists, including Mark Rothko, Clifford Still, and Mark Tobey, as well as Pollock. All, like Krasner's solo, were organized by curator Brian Robertson, a strong supporter of the New American Painting Abroad, who particularly admired Lee's work as well as Pollock's. One critic described viewing the pounding overall rhythms of the larger works in her London show as an exhilarating experience. And a number of British reviewers agreed she could definitely be judged by the same yardstick as her predecessors in that, quote, excellent series of outstanding American painters. Unlike her frequent marginalization up to that time by American counterparts, including not just critics, but also male curators and art historians who left her out of important exhibitions, catalogs, and books, numerous British reviewers, many of them men, felt that she demonstrated an equal power and freedom. Kenneth Coote Smith, writing in the Art Review, described seeing many ordinary Britons visiting the Krasner show, quote, standing in astonishment that such a clearly important painter has been so long neglected. In an interview published in the Sunday London Times during the Whitechapel retrospective, Krasner herself remarked, "This is the biggest and most important exhibition ever of my work. Things have been loaded against me in New York. Here I could get a fighting chance of some unprejudiced criticism. I cannot say that I chose to come to London," she added, "as I was invited. But had I been able to choose, this is where I would have wanted to come." As her New York friend, B.H. Friedman, explained in the Whitechapel catalog, this event provided for Krasner, quote, probably the first occasion in 25 years when the air is tolerably free of other vibrations. The other vibrations, of course, meaning Jackson Pollock. Miss Krasner, noted London reviewer Nigel Gosling concluded after seeing the show, is a worthy portent of a moment which will go down in painting history. The more recent time around, not only did Krasner's work engender similar ecstatic accolades in Britain and in several European countries where the Barbican retrospective traveled, but also by writers who came to see it from the USA, many at its final stop, the Guggenheim Bilbao. Catching Krasner living color in its London incarnation, Peter Plagens, writing in the Wall Street Journal, heaped praise on what he called a superbly cool, concise, complete, and most important, compelling exhibition, applauding in particular the large, brilliant canvases, he called them, that so well held their own in the Barbican's difficult, brutalist design main gallery. These Plagens enthused presented just about the best roomful of abstract paintings I've seen. His fulsome appraisal predominantly judged Krasner's works on their own merits, not ignoring, but neither overplaying the typical American emphasis on comparisons with Pollock. Now, this one's my favorite. Similar in intent, Waldemar Janacek of the London Times celebrated the Barbican show as a rousing and persuasive tribute to Krasner's amazing talent. He did place her in juxtaposition to Pollock at the very start of his review, but his comparison interrogates past patterns that either emphasize the impact of Krasner's subservience to her husband's advancements during his lifetime, try to characterize, as did Rose, their relationship as working partners all along, or make various attempts to elevate Krasner's status to seminal, a very male-oriented term of praise, by seeking to identify what she supposedly originated and Pollock then took up. Robertson, in 1965, must have considered it the highest of compliments when he wrote, "At certain stages, her own gaze was brought to bear on her husband's work and expanded his consciousness." To properly view the differences exhibited by the most current show and catalog, it's worth quoting Janacek's entire opening salvo, as he employed it cleverly to frame key parameters of the Barbican retrospective's renewed focus, arguing as well the ongoing relevance of Krasner's story to the culture wars of today. "Poor Lee Krasner," Janacek wrote. "When the gods of art arranged for her to marry Jackson Pollock, they cursed her on several levels. On a personal level, they forced her to put up with the madnesses, plural, of a violent alcoholic who died in a drunken car crash with another woman on his side. On a professional level, they ensured that her career would be blown out of the water by the nuclear fame of her partner. On a creative level, they barged her into an unequal struggle for an artist's voice, trying to find her own song while the roaring Pollock hogged the microphone. Perhaps, though," he shrewdly went on to state, "we have underestimated those sneaky gods of art. Perhaps they were playing a longer game and knew all along that at some point in the future, the art world would seek to recalculate the male-female imbalance. The taste for macho painting styles would evaporate and a taste for its alternative would grow. Right now," and this was in 2019, "being Jackson Pollock is problematic, but being Lee Krasner is exciting." The many changes in focus Krasner chose to make, I need the move of the Barbican show. The many changes in focus Krasner chose to make during her roughly half century of art production, as criticized in previous accounts like Danto's, are remarked much more positively by Janacek later in his review. "Nowhere in the rule book," he asserts, "does it say impressive art careers need to follow straight lines. The rationale for such adjustments and how they function progressively plays a much more central role throughout the Barbican catalog as well as in the show. The various twists and turns Krasner incorporated throughout her development, including bouts of destruction, refocus, recapitulation, and revision, are no longer held against her or considered negative factors in the establishment of a first-rate reputation. Throughout her lifetime, Krasner was continuously criticized for not coming up commensurate to the men with a recognizable and consistent signature style. Moreover, she didn't seem to care. Change, she always insisted, was for her the only constant, a point referred to on the wall text at the Barbican and in the catalog many times. What might be termed Lee Krasner's ongoing operational self-critique, as Janacek observed without employing this theoretical term, appears clearly in the selection of works Eleanor Nairn placed on view at the Barbican, and in a variety of ways was examined for its merits in each of the 4 main essays included in the show's accompanying catalog. Incorporated as well in this handsomely designed book is an unpublished 1970 interview with the artist by Levin, an updated bibliography, and an illustrated and annotated chronology, as well as a series of 10 short narratives prefacing full-page color illustrations from the individual groupings comprising the content on exhibit in the Barbican show. These sequential narrative sections correspond to the trajectory of the artist's career. They were interspersed with close-up color photographs of Krasner and Pollock's house and its environs. These were interspersed with close-up color photographs of Krasner and Pollock's house and its environs in East Hampton, especially the flowers growing nearby. You can see some of those to the far left here. These were photographed by her friend Ray Kaiser Eames, and various size blow-ups were included on the museum's walls. Also prefacing some of these shorter texts are black and white photos of Hans Hofmann teaching at a school where Krasner studied, and of the artist posing with, or at least at work on important paintings during different stages of her career. That's next now. Yeah, well, all right, leave it. Nairn's primary essay, To Breathe and Be Alive, its title taken from a quote by the artist about what she aimed for in creating a composition, Be Alive is the point, Krasner said, highlights the pertinent foundational influences of her life, both situational and artistic, emphasizing, as has frequently been done, the challenge Krasner threw out to her viewers and commentators. Be alive is the point, Krasner said. Oh, sorry. She said that, she didn't say that again. What she's going to say now is, my painting is so biographical if anyone can take the trouble to read it. Nairn introduces Krasner as a ruthless editor and conjectures that the artist herself may have considered her lack of recognition as perhaps a blessing, allowing her to make the work she felt impelled to make. Without a coterie of controlling dealers and collectors, true to her own spirit, Nairn expounds, she was never forced to repeat herself, but could flow with each new direction as it came. Katie Siegel's essay, and you people out there must know her since she teaches at Stony Brook and has lots of associations with you. Her essay was called Nothing Outside Nature. It focuses on Krasner's visual as well as experiential organic thinking and reconsiders its impact on her approach to making art. Despite her obvious, quote, urbanness, in other words, immigrant Jewish identity, emphasized by Hobbes and by Levin in her 2011 biography, the artist's relationship to nature, starting in her Brooklyn childhood when the area was more rural and amplified after her marriage and relocation from New York City to Long Island, here you see them there, Siegel maintains these were critical to understanding her motivations, a topic that Hobbes also approached in his Denver essay. Above all, Siegel writes, Krasner's relationship to nature took complicated form in her relationship to her own work, to how it was made and to her place in the world. She points out that the cyclical character of nature, marked upon frequently by the painter herself, played a key role in Krasner's refusal to remain static. Natural processes of seeding, flowering, dormancy, and its reputation are recapitulated in her artistry. The title of critic and poet John Yau's excellent contribution, Writing Rimbaud on the Wall, refers to the famously self-reflective lines of that French author from A Season in Hell of 1873. Krasner asked the painter Byron Brown to scroll these lines on one of her studio partitions. To whom should I hire myself out? What beast must I adore? What holy image attack? What lie must I maintain? In what blood tread? Rather than attaching these lines to her connection to Pollock as usual, and they do seem to fit, Yau uses Krasner's fascination with Rimbaud to highlight her deeply felt need for exploration of her own multiple selves, undertaken in the face of realizing that the struggle for artistic freedom was a complicated, arduous, and ceaseless undertaking. He brings in additional literary influences and assesses their generative role. These include Maeterlinck, Novalis, and Edgar Allan Poe, whom Yau believes contributed as well to Krasner's lifelong resistance to categorization that he, like myself and others, also found exemplified in the altered names she adopted at different times. She had a different name in the Hoffman School than she did in 1957. And the Hoffman School was different than when she was a child. Calling attention to details and ruptures in such works as Krasner's 1953 collage, The City, Yau is most adamant of all the catalog authors in rejecting those in the past who spent so much time hunting for signs of influence in either direction with regard to the mutually beneficial artistic relationship of Krasner and her husband. My interest, Yau writes, is in what distinguishes her work from that of her contemporaries, its strange beauty, bringing his argument back again to writers she admired, Rimbaud most specifically. He explains that by periodically attacking failed works and transforming them into something fresh and new, as you can see, similar collaged elements, the little red ones, from her own work are used in another painting the following year. Krasner both literally and metaphorically authored her own history. I think Yau conjectures this is what Krasner wanted to achieve more than anything else. In the final living color essay, Present Conditional, USC art history professor Suzanne Hudson borrows her title from one of the most important examples of what Yau describes, Krasner's magisterial 1976 collage paintings, shown to great acclaim at Pace the following year. To create these large works, Krasner famously cut and spliced, mostly into slivered shards, a number of the abstractly figurative charcoal drawings she had made at the Hoffman School, then stored away. and then with Brian Robertson in her studio, later rediscovered. She combined these with ghost-like reverse impressions rubbed off from the back of stacked unfixed pages, as well as sections of raw canvas and areas of freshly applied pigment. Krasner grouped these works into a series titled 11 Ways to Use the Words to See. Each was named for a different verb tense, borrowing from a linguistic system suggesting time and its conditions. In present conditional, a designation based on the verb form I would be seeing, I should probably emphasize the would. She organized the composition into grids that recall a subset of her own 1947 to 50 breakthrough little images. The works in this late 70s series overall reflect several Hoffman corrective techniques that as a student she had rejected, but now understood, such as cutting up a composition and repositioning its parts, as you just saw her do, or pasting small pieces of colored work onto it to guide its reworking. The ultimate example of Krasner's intermittent use of collage to both reconsider the past and move forward, this late burst of energy was described by the artist herself as corresponding to an imperative, and that's the name of the work, the first work in the series, meaning I experienced the need not just to examine these drawings, but a peremptory desire to change them, a command, as it were, to make them new. An ending that is also a beginning is perhaps a structural ploy, Hudson's essay concludes, effectively creating a scene of origin for Krasner's emergence as an artist on her own terms. As Hudson explains, would, a modal verb form, can be used to reference either past or present. And Krasner's twinning of these temporalities, what could have been and what might still come, was one way of her confidently asserting and reflecting at an age well beyond the lifespans of Pollock and most of her more celebrated colleagues, I would assume that she was still there. Mulling over my invigorating visit to the Barbican show and the fresh looks at Krasner's oeuvre incorporated there, as well as in these essays, I found myself thinking more and more of Janacek's witty exclamation, "Ah, those sneaky gods of art." This keenly insightful declaration about the ongoing revision of Krasner's career helped inspire me to frame an essay on paintings by a larger female cohort for Abstract Expressionists, the Women, a book co-authored with Joan Martyr and published in London this past January. Already selling well, it will become the catalog for a 2025 to 2027 U.S. traveling exhibition I'm curating for the American Federation of Arts, comprising a carefully chosen selection from an outstanding group of over 120 works by American women abstract expressionists. This collection has been assembled by British connoisseur Christian Levitt, the current owner of Krasner's Prophecy, whose primary home is a palazzo in Florence. Pretty cool, huh? In this brand new effort, the vital role for advancing modernism played by Krasner and many also talented female colleagues, you know what that is? That's the warning. That's the storm alert warning. Oh, well, I'll start again. In this brand new effort, the vital role for advancing modernism played by Krasner and many also talented female colleagues, likewise still requiring greater exposure and appreciation, comes to life with detailed analysis, direct statements from the women themselves, a dedicated chronology, and brilliant color illustrations. Since it might have gotten garbled there, I'm talking about the new book. I hope many of you will find the time to read it and eventually to see the show at one of its various upcoming US venues, a tour still in the organizing stage. I guarantee you'll find it impossible to deny the significance to art history of so many unique and stunning works. Although she was not overtly sympathetic to the women's movement, objecting especially to organic aspects of her work being interpreted as essentialist, Krasner did concede it had benefits for her reputation. She would no doubt be delighted that the Barbican retrospective, combined with her prominent inclusion just this year in a Whitechapel organized European traveling show of global abstractions by women, have served to reintroduce her to new generations worldwide. Yes, we can finally agree. Being Lee Krasner now is truly exciting. Thank you. Can't hear you. Helen. Can't hear, Helen, can't hear.
You couldn't hear me say how terrific that was, how much
Yeah.
we enjoyed it. And I'm looking to see if there are any questions or comments in the chat. But at the moment, I don't see any. So I'm going to open it up for Q&A. If anyone would like to comment, please unmute yourselves.
I think Joan has something to say.
Okay. You're not unmuted, Joan. You're still muted.
Can't hear you.
Mute.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
Ellen, that was wonderful, brilliant, and quite
Great,
a
thank you.
presentation of Lee and her very important development of an independent style. But I wanted to go back to something that really has always impressed me. I'm very fond of her collages, and I remember when she was doing collages during during Jackson Pollock's lifetime, she was actually using pieces of his work that cut apart. And I thought that was very meaningful because it was, and actually you wrote an article for the Woman's Art Journal where he was holding one of her collages that included some of the use of her own, of his pieces of a work that was cut apart. And I appreciate everything that you presented in terms of the reaction to her before Pollock's death and the contrast that was being set up in many instances. But I think that it would be interesting for you to comment a little bit more on the fact that he agreed and even had himself photographed holding one of her collages that shows a kind of interaction and acceptance of the direction that she was taking.
Sure. The one, I don't know whether you can forget about it. We won't get back to it, but the bald eagle actually had pieces of Pollock's work in it. Well, it's kind of interesting, especially in light of the recent New Yorker expose of the cult of the Sullivanians. Did anybody read that? The people that were going to Sullivan and his acolytes for psychiatric care, because Clement Greenberg sent Jackson Pollock there, and eventually Krasner was sent to Len Siegel, who was also a Sullivanian. And it's rather interesting because amongst the things that Sullivan said to Pollock were, you can have affairs and you can do what you want and this and that and whatever. But he also talked about the ways in which sort of cooperation, co-opting, whatever, that had an impact on Krasner at the time, because she was just beginning to start to get back into her own work. I mean, there was a long period of time in which she really wasn't doing that, especially after her Betty Parsons fiasco. So this kind of coincided with the bad advice that Pollock was getting and the sort of advice that she was getting. And she actually wrote some pages, which are probably like diary pages, that she wrote to Len Siegel about how she shouldn't be satisfied with what she had been doing all of that time, to promote his career and make hers be irrelevant. So the reason I mention that is because this coincides, this is the early 50s, this coincides with her making these collages in which she used pieces of Pollock's work. Obviously, I don't know if he actually handed her drawings and said, "I don't like these, you can cut them up," or whether he cut them up and put them in a trash can and she picked them up off the floor. But he definitely knew about this. They were very friendly with Donald and Carol Brader, who owned the House of Books and Music in East Hampton, and I was able to interview Carol Brader before she died. And Carol Brader said that one Christmas, which must be the Christmas of 1953 or 4, one Christmas, Pollock and Krasner said, "Can we come over?" And she said, "Sure, come over." And they walked in with a package all wrapped up, okay. and said, "Merry Christmas. Here's your Christmas present." Her husband was still alive then, so she and Donald opened it up, and it was one of these collages in which Krasner used pieces of Pollock's drawings, and Carol told me that the first thing Pollock did was point to them and said, "Look how Lee's used some of my works." Okay. And then, of course, that photograph kind of confirms, clearly he knew that this was going on. This was a time period in which he wasn't working anymore, not much working anymore. So there's two things going on here in my mind. One is that she was having so much trouble in her marriage at this time, and they weren't really close. One is that by using pieces of his work and combining them with her own, that was a way to kind of project onto the canvas a closeness that she missed in their actual marriage. And another is that he maybe was letting her voice what he couldn't do anymore. In other words, there's a strong possibility. I mean, I wrote a lot more about this in that article, and I think that these works are evidence of the complicated nature of their relationship. I didn't think her relationship was as simple as Barbara Rose tried to make it out to be, that they were working partners. I mean, and that's why this whole idea of the erotics of influence, this actually comes from an essay by David Shapiro in a catalog by Cynthia McCabe called Artistic Collaboration in the 20th Century. And I thought maybe something along these lines would come up. So I took a couple of notes from there. The convoluted and sexually charged web of dependence and autonomy inherent in any meaningful affiliation is what he called the erotics of influence. And my feeling here is that both were altered as creative personalities and as individuals by the emotional subtext of their association, which shows up the most in those collages. But you can see it in other ways throughout her work. So I hope that answers.
There's a question here from, or a comment and a question from Elizabeth Langhorn. She says, "Terrific overview. One stray question. What do you think of Krasner's title, 'The Eye is the First Circle,' its import?" And she mentions that some insight may be found in her recent article, "Self-Betrayal or Self-Deception, the Case of Jackson Pollock," in the March 2023 issue of Arts.
Oh, wow. I'd like to read that.
Arts 12.
I wasn't aware of that, Elizabeth. Send me a link. I don't know. I mean, "The Eye is the First Circle" is a literary reference. I'm not certain what connections she was making at that time. I have to admit that I've not on top of that particular. Would you like to talk?
I know it's quite just a single detail, but it might be quite interesting, and I'll definitely make sure you get that.
Yeah.
link.
Well, could you give us a 2-sentence
Oh, well,
version of that so that everybody else can hear?
well, in that recent article, I stressed again, I seem to be stuck on when Moon cuts the circle.
Yeah.
And there's a study drawing that, that Pollock gave to Friedman as a gift, from his
sure.
And that has words alongside it in which, the female creature with its dagger is underneath the first circle, which is the Ouroboros circle, the serpent, which was a strong image for Pollock. And he basically cut out from that. And the act that he took to release, these energies, which was when the first pourings happened, was, when he cut the circle, well, it allowed, if you will, the birth of Jack's son. In other words, the dialogue between male and female really
And
started to happen as he kind of cut away from the
And is Krasner referring to that in your opinion?
Yeah, actually, because well, again, I should go and look, you know, at where it falls in her career. To be honest, I haven't done that.
I think it comes from Emerson, doesn't it? Yeah.
I don't know.
First
Does
line
it?
I think
of an
that I think it comes from Emerson.
Oh, really?
you could-
Okay, well then
So you could also start, make
Yeah.
make connections to the organic, you know, nature and so on. I think there's also all kinds of things that
Yeah.
possibly can happen. By the way, I didn't mention this in the talk, because the talk was really more sort of like reception theory, but needless to say, another thing that is helping it to be Krasner's moment is the prices she's getting at auction, including the Eye is the First Circle, which sold for an enormous amount of money. So that, you know, so that kind of helps to make Lee Krasner more exciting these days.
Yeah.
Okay, somebody else, Bradley, he's asking to unmute? Helen?
Oh, Bradley, well, he could unmute himself, I guess, let me find him. There we go. Okay.
Did you have something to say, Brad?
No, I didn't. I enjoyed the talk greatly, but I don't know what gave you the indication
Because
that I had a
there was a
question.
big thing, yes to unmute.
Oh,
I
I
don't
don't
know
know
if
what
you-
happened.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for putting this all together and talking about each individual part, and that it's always interesting. A bad word, because interesting, what does that mean? But
Yeah,
but it is elucidating the interaction between Pollock and it's I enjoyed hearing what you had
thanks,
to
Ron,
say.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm happy that you were able to connect from Canada. We have all kinds of people that connected from all kinds of places.
That's
Yeah.
the genius of Zoom.
It
But
is.
I'm glad that you mentioned the 9th Street women, because I think that what Mary Gabriel has done is to weave these stories together in a way that makes it very accessible and very, very human. But one of the criticisms of the book that I had heard, in fact, she and I had a dialogue at Joan Mitchell's gallery a couple of years ago, I guess when the book came out, it was pre-COVID anyway, was that she placed too much emphasis on their male companions or husbands or partners. And on the other hand, you could hardly ignore them or leave them out, because they did play such a primary role in the perception of the movement. But the fact that she was able to bring the women to life, even in reference to the men, I think was a very valuable contribution.
Well, that was a particularly tricky scenario that Joan and I dealt with in the book that we just did. Okay, the chronology for this book is really 99% about women. Okay, in other words, and if some male name is brought in, it's brought in the women are the subject, and the I mean, you can't not say that these people went to the Hoffman School. I mean, stuff like that. So
you can't say that they were not married to or
exactly
companions of their male
exactly. And you really can't talk about Joan Mitchell without talking about Rhea Pell, et cetera. So that was a really kind of tricky game that we played in trying to, because the book is called Abstract Expressionists: the Women. Okay, and so we worked very hard to not leave it out if it was important, but to underplay it. And I did point out in my talk that you know that Pollock lurks in the background of almost every single one of those 5 women.
Mhm.
I mean, maybe less so for Grace Hartigan, because she was really more influenced, I think, by de Kooning. But I think that Pollock lurks in the background, and Pollock lurked in the background of a you know, I mean, Helen Frankenthaler for sure. You know, Pollock lurked in the background of a lot of the women that we were, that we were dealing with, and of course, Joan dealing with the sculptors. I mean, she had David Smith and whatever. So you can't tell the story without them, and we had a lot of conversations with Chris Levitt about that. You can't omit them altogether, okay? But I think one of the I use this as an epigraph for the article, that, you know, something about that critic Roberta Smith wrote about the past is becoming more female all the time. And it's a better quote than that, but that's the gist of it. Well, that's true, because this was always there. It just was never
Acknowledged.
never thought to be important enough
Mm.
to be acknowledged. And so many of the women, they were showing it, Art of the Century. They were showing with Betty Parsons. They were, you know, et cetera, but they're kind of, you know, lost in the weeds. That's why I think that I love that review by Janacek. I thought he nailed it on the head. He really did. He said it in such a clever way, that those sneaky gods of art were playing a long game.
Now, here's a question from Bryce Barker. Do you
Yeah.
have any suggestions for looking at abstract art for someone who hasn't paid much attention to it?
Oh my. Go to the museum. I don't know where you are. Go to the Museum of Modern Art. Go to the Guggenheim. Go to gallery shows. Go to see as much as you possibly can. There's all kinds of wonderful books. But that would be a syllabus that I would have to write and send, and send to you. But I think keeping an open mind and keeping it's not just colored shapes and forms or whatever, you know, because even the colored shapes and forms by Mondrian had other meaning, et cetera. So I think that you have to sort of delve some more into.
In New York, we're very spoiled because we have MoMA and the Met and the Guggenheim.
That's right.
And of course, there are some wonderful museums out in the rest of the country and abroad that have excellent examples. But
Right.
I think that we have an embarrassment of riches here.
Well, the very interesting sort of coda to some of the work that Joan and I were doing is that Chris Levitt is now going to be opening the first museum in Europe dedicated to women artists only. He's opening that. He's reconfiguring his museum in Mougins to be a museum of women artists.
Interesting.
So that I don't.
Well, we look forward to that exhibition. I hope.
Yeah, well, Katie Watt is one here, and she has a museum devoted to women artists. Because
I was just going to say, I will say we were the
Yeah.
first in the world, but yes,
Yeah.
on U.S. shores. So
yes, on U.S. shores. So now he thinks that Europeans should have that experience too,
And so they should.
and so they should. And he he.
So please keep us posted on the exhibition tour, and
Yeah.
we'll hope it will, unlike the Krasner show at the Barbican that did not come to the US.
Right.
She hasn't had a retrospective here in 25 years, so it's about time. But I hope that we will be able to see the fruits of the Christian Levitt collection as well. One other question I see here. From Jody Klotz. Do you think that there are still many women ABEX and color field artists of the period that are relevant or important who have yet to be discovered?
Probably not. There are some people who are being looked at that, never got looked at before, like Dusty Banger, but US relevant and important. So probably not, but nothing's impossible.
Remains to be seen. Well,
Yeah.
I want to thank you so much, Ellen, for this. It's really enjoyed it. And I hope that everyone will come back next week for our final lecture in this series, when Robert Hobbs will be speaking on Krasner and Motherwell and the abstract expressionist collage. I want to thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next week.
And I want to thank you too.
Stay dry, stay dry, Ellen.
All my friends and colleagues and so forth. On a rainy Sunday, it's delightful for me.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.